Hello everyone and welcome back to the Endgame class. As always, my name is Caleb Denby and today I'm going to be taking you through the Endgame technique of Ulf Andersson. Of course, we are going to be going through some crushing games where Ulf, despite having even material and despite having sometimes even just objectively equal positions, is able to somehow, some way, defeat his opponents through some crushing endgame technique. So let's just jump right into it. First up, I have a game of Ulf's against Karl Robatsch, and I'm actually noticing that this could be made slightly bigger, which I'm going to do now. Bam! All right, looks good. And let's just jump into the game. So, Ulf Andersson starts with knight f3, knight f6, c4, c5, g3, b6. None of this matters. Why are we looking at this? Is this an opening class? No, this is an endgame class. Pieces are being traded. This is good. More piece trades, a6, and all of a sudden, look at that. Look at that. Move 15, and we're in an endgame. I love it. I love it. So, Ulf Andersson here has the white pieces against, as I said, Karl, last name, whose last name is hard for me to say with my mouth, Robatsch, T-S-C-H, that's a tough one. So what do we think is going on here? Of course, black's last move, a6, might be considered a little bit dubious. The idea is, of course, you just keep this knight out of b5, and you allow your pieces sort of another alternate route into the game, right? For example, if you play a move like knight d7, this is perfectly fine for black as well, but Karl chooses a6 in this case. Robatsch. I'm never gonna get it. Anyways, so what do we think is going on here? Of course, if anybody is to be preferred, it should be white, right? White has this knight on d4 compared to this knight on b8. The rooks are connected, whereas black's rooks are disconnected. But is it really going to be enough for an advantage? Well, Ulf Andersson says yes. He says absolutely this is enough for an advantage. Is Karl German? I don't know a ton about Karl Robatsch, to be honest with you, but we are focusing on Ulf today. Just say Robotnik. That'll work. Okay, I'll just say robot. Anyways, how do you press positions like these for an advantage with white? Well, obviously, the thing to do is, number one, try to activate your own pieces, and number two, try to make sure it's not easy for your opponent to get some activity. So how can you go about doing that? Well, Ulf starts with this move rook a to c1, which is of course sort of the most natural move in the position. What's the point of rook c1? Well, the point is it prevents natural development. Knight d7, no longer playable, because rook c7 is going to invade sort of with a devastating effect. You put this rook on c7, now all of a sudden black's pieces are totally immobilized, and here, what was at first glance sort of a very innocuous position is suddenly turning into some very serious advantage for white. For example, you could very easily already lose a pawn or more to stuff like knight e6 and rook takes d7, when this rook is just going to be a monster on the 7th rank. Rook b7, b5, rook b6, for example, and white is close to winning. So, knight d7, not playable. You have to keep this rook out of the 7th rank. So you see every move Ulf plays is with the idea of activating his own pieces or preventing his opponent from activating his pieces as well. Yes, and the chat is telling me Karl here is Austrian. Good to know. Okay, so rook a7, and how does Ulf continue? Well, we got this rook active, we might as well try to activate this guy as well. And so he starts with the move rook c2. Number one, guarding his own 2nd rank. Number two, preparing to double up on the c-file if necessary. And then Karl responds with rook d8. So how do you want to deal with this idea of rook d8? What should white play in response? What do you think? What can be done here? How should we respond to rook d8? And why? So you guys have the right idea. The right idea is to just play e3. I think practically this is the best move. But why is e3 better than, let's say, knight f3, for example? At least get his name right? I mean, I would if I could. The number of times I'm prepping these lectures and I get sidetracked for 20 minutes trying to figure out how to pronounce somebody's name, it's obscene, I'm going to be honest with you. If you think I'm getting Karl's name wrong, just wait for the next game, all right? You just wait for the next game. You just wait for game number 2 of tonight. So yeah, there are some good points here. Knight f3 sort of undevelops our knight. Our knight's good on d4. But the point I really want to get across is that if we can help it, we want the C file to effectively be the only open file on the board. We control the C file right now. And we want the C file to be the file that matters. And with E3, we are trying to ensure that the D file stays closed, that this file does not matter. Of course, black does have an option to sort of open this file by force, and we're going to see that a little bit later in this game, in fact, on the next move. But this idea still sort of stands. You want the only open file that matters to be the one that you're in control of. And so with e3, Ulf is trying to keep this D file blocked, or in the case of e5, which is played, provoke his opponent into creating more weaknesses. So after e5, it's true we do in fact have to move this knight, but after the natural move, knight f3, all of a sudden now things are happening with tempo, right? We are attacking this e5 pawn, and we are provoking our opponent to make even more weaknesses in his position. And so now black plays the move, probably the best move, f6, just defending this pawn on e5. Now let's see if you guys can spot Ulf's next idea to continue pressing this position for an advantage. By the way, I want to say, already white is significantly better, right? It looks like black has done nothing wrong, but white is very significantly better already in this position. Double up. So yeah, double up is a good move. I'm not going to lie. Rook fc1, great move. But Ulf's idea is very, very instructive. Very instructive. Rook fc1 is great. It's a great move. I'm not going to get mad about anybody playing rook f to c1 here. But if you play rook fc1, then your next move should be the move that Ulf plays here. And yeah, it's not h4. It's not h4. h4 is not the idea. h4 doesn't actually help white here. It's the move g4. And g4 is the type of move that looks great once you see it, but can be sort of difficult to come up with on your own, right? It looks sort of unnatural to move a pawn from g3 to g4. But what's the idea? The idea is f6 is a weakness in black's camp. How is black ever going to solve this weakness? Well, sometimes maybe he'll push to f5 and e4, right? If we ever, for example, end up on the 6th rank, the f-pawn tries moving, it's probably going to move to f5. And if we play a move like h4, for example, obviously f5 here hangs this pawn. But let's say, a couple moves happen, and f5. And even on a really good day for black, let's say e4. These pawns are going to be difficult to sort of break down, right? Once black has achieved this super ultra awesome chain of pawns, it's going to be a lot more difficult to probe at those pawns to make meaningful threats. Whereas if we play g4 here, now if the move f5 ever comes on the board, white is going to be very happy to capture this pawn when these guys are starting to look very, very loose out here on the 5th rank of the board. Now, obviously, these examples I'm showing are a little bit, silly, because that's not really how the game is going to go immediately. But these are the sort of ideas. You play g4 to hamper your opponent's pawns, to prevent them from advancing forward, and sort of locking in that weakness on f6. So, okay. g4 is Ulf's move here, and I think it's a really, really good one, really instructive one. Of course, you can start with rook c1, but then, after some move, then you should probably be following this move up with g4. Like, you really should be playing g4 to try and lock in those weaknesses. So g4 played first. Now, Rook D6 is played by black, trying to take control over all of these important squares on the 7th and 6th ranks, and Ulf at this point does double his rooks. Karl's idea was to bring this guy out to D7, and he does exactly that. And now, once again, how do you play this position for an advantage with white? Do you come to C7? Do you come to C6? Do you try to reroute this knight somehow? Do you come to C8 even? What do you do? Where do you go with your pieces here? G5 has been suggested as well. It's an interesting one. Aryan says, do not rush. No rushing for Aryan. Rook C7 has been suggested. Rook C6. Rook E2 is a bit of a strange one to me. Bit of a strange one. So yeah, I think G5 is a bit of a mistake here. I think G5 is a bit of a mistake. I don't know if F5 is actually the best move, but E4 is playable. And if you go somewhere like knight D4, well then you're sort of asking for this. If you take on F6 first, you're sort of just activating your opponent's pieces, right? Something like knight F6, knight D4, for example, and rook over to F7. And all of a sudden, black is fighting back with some counterplay. So I like this pawn on G4. We are keeping this pawn stuck on F6. We're not encouraging it to move forward just yet. So Rook C7 I also think is the wrong idea. We've always been told, you know, put the rooks on the 7th and they are going to be very, very powerful. But in this case, by going to the 7th rank, you're actually leaving yourself sort of on an empty rank here, right? There's not too much going on the 7th rank that's of interest to white. All of black's weaknesses are on the 6th rank. B6, F6, A6, they're all stuck on the 6th rank. And so the 6th rank is the rank that white should be interested in. And that's why we see Ulf play the move Rook C6. This idea of knight D2, by the way, is pretty much just equally as good as Rook C6, but I do like starting with Rook C6 for the reason that this knight on F3 is already useful here, pressuring this E5 pawn. We'll see in a second that Ulf does actually reroute this knight, but for the moment, I like leaving it on F3 in case black does get any funny business ideas. Playing for F5, you can always go to H4 to pressure that guy, or, you know, just pressure E5 as well. So I like the knight on F3 for the moment, which is why I think starting with C6, Rook C6 is good. Black is more or less forced to take this if you try to step out of the way. I guess stepping out of the way would be playable, but you leave white with this active rook nonetheless, and this rook is sort of useless here for black. I'm not totally sure what this guy is doing. So we see Karl trade this guy off instead, and then go king F7. Now, I would ask you how to make progress, but I sort of spoiled it. Ulf now realizes that the other piece that needs improvement is this knight here on F3, and so he steps to D2. We see king E7, and then he steps the knight to E4. And we still have not won any material with white. We've played about 10 moves in this endgame so far, and believe it or not, white's position has gone from approximately equal, of course a small pull thanks to his developmental advantage, to almost entirely winning. Just with the piece play that Ulf has managed here. He's drawn his opponent forward into making weaknesses, and is now exploiting those weaknesses and really locking in the black pieces. This knight is a sad, entirely passive piece. This king also passively defending F6. And like, what is this rook? Just what is this rook? What is it? I don't know what this is, but it's a bad piece. That's what it is. Rook B7 was played here by Karl, which is, I mean, it's a good a move as any. He can't really move any of his pieces. And now B4 is played by Ulf, just taking a little bit of extra space, making sure this knight's ever jumping out to C5. And now after Rook B8, see if you can find Ulf's winning idea. This is where things really start to collapse here for black. This is where things, very visibly start to fall apart. Knight d8 to knight c6, knight d6 to knight c8. I don't know about that one in particular. That does look like the funniest idea, but probably not the greatest idea. So what's a better square to check this king from than c8? Of course, as you guys are in the chat are saying, it's the d5 square. Knight c3 is the way to go here, and knight d5 now is sort of unstoppable. With knight d5 sort of coming, if black were to pass somehow, let's say rook b7, knight d5, king f7. It's true that black isn't losing any material immediately, but at this point we're going to see something sort of similar to what happened in the game, where white can sort of just slowly advance now with the king, moves like king f3, moves like king g3, and advance on the king side with the pawns as well. Ideas of h4. So rather than go for this passive position, black instead tried this move f5 finally, with this knight, leaving the king side slash center. Black felt the moment was right to try to push with f5. But now, after knight d5 check, king f7, king g3, just defending this pawn. We see the move h5 now by black, again, trying to sort of break free for some trades, but g takes f5, g takes f5, and this is just entirely dead now for black. I've said that before, but it's still true. Rook d6 was the accurate choice by Ulf, drawing this rook back up to b7, where it is, passively defending. It could have gone to the king side from b8, but now it's very well stuck on b7. And now white simply wins with king h4, and this pawn is indefensible. King g7 by black, king takes h5, and black had enough in this position, and white, and he actually resigned here, and Ulf went on, well, it didn't go on to win. Wolf, he just won. He just won here, All he did was sort of slowly invade with his pieces, and then black just entirely crumbled under the pressure here. And there are, like, somewhere in the realm of 80 games by Ulf Andersson that look almost exactly like this one. Some innocuous endgame, Ulf starts playing with his pieces, and then, his opponents just fall apart. This guy was an absolute monster in the endgame. So let's recap here. This is a 33 move game, all right? We have this endgame appearing on move 15. Black plays this slightly inaccurate line, I believe. But what do we have? I mean, we have here in this position, the pawn structure is literally identical. Okay, it's literally identical, right? The only difference in the position is the placement of the knights. That is literally the only difference in the position. White's knight is here, black's knight is here. And then after the move a6, which I'm not going to lie, I don't think is the best move. I think rook c8 is good to, contest this open file. I think something like knight d7, something like knight a6 should be considered. But a6, I mean, it's not like a bad move. Rook ac1 is the start of the end, right? You have to play rook a7 now to keep this rook out. And then rook c2, simply doubling. Rook d8, e3 now to defend this knight. And I think e5 is really, the first major mistake by black. And ever since this, Ulf was in control and never really let go. After e5, black has a weakness, and that's all Ulf Andersson needed to win this game. Knight f3, f6, and now after g4, black's kingside pawns are frozen, and there's no way to comfortably develop. This rook is to the 6th rank. This knight is improved all the way to d5, and just like that, the game is over. King h4, king takes h5, and black resigns. That's just, it's obscene. So any questions on this game? Before we move on to Ulf Andersson Crush number 2. Ulf Andersson Crush number 2 up next. All right, let's go ahead and switch back to the full camera view. I'm very set up today. Very set up. And let's take a look at Ulf Andersson up against Dimitrij Bunzmann. Bunzmann is how I'm choosing to pronounce this name. All right. Please leave in the comments below how to correctly pronounce Bunzmann. Bunzmann? I don't know. How do we know that the endgame phase has started? It's a good question. It's one that I have tried to tackle before. on the show. Basically, it's open to interpretation. Some people will tell you the end game starts when the king is, no longer vulnerable to checkmating attacks. Some people will tell you it's when this number of pieces are left on the board. But, there's always exceptions to the rules. Of course, in major piece endgames, there are positions that most people would agree is an endgame, but the king isn't really totally safe yet to play. But it just depends. It's sort of a feeling. The endgame is when you feel. Okay, so let's take a look. We have another opening of some kind. It's another English by Ulf, by the way. And more moves were played. Nobody really cares. Why do we care about this? Trade more pieces. Please trade more pieces. Oh my god, please trade more pieces. There's still too many pieces. Is there too many pieces? When was I going to start the end game here? Yeah, no, there's too many pieces left. No, okay. This I am calling a type of endgame. It's more of a late middle game, but I'm going to call it an endgame because the play from here on out sort of just revolves around attacking weaknesses, right? And so for my purposes, I'm going to call it an endgame. I'm not going to lie to you. It's pretty early to be calling this an endgame, but you know what? I don't care. I'm in charge here. I feel it's the endgame, right? Okay. So we just saw this trade. Bishop takes e5, d takes e5 by Ulf. We see queen e7, and then Ulf goes for another change of structure with e4, f takes e4, and queen takes e4. Okay, getting rid of his doubled pawns. Makes some sense. Okay, knight c6 is played now. And I want to ask your feeling on this position, chat room. How do we feel how do we feel about this position? Do we like it for white? Should black somehow be okay? What's the feeling here? Chess King likes white. White is Andersson, first of all. It's an excellent point. White is better. So why is white doing so well here? Everybody tends to agree, but what is it? So yeah, black has a weak d7 pawn, and that is, of course, the major focus that you should first of all notice. There's also another real reason why white should be better, and that reason, in addition to the d7 weakness, is that he has all this kingside space, right? And space is usually, of course, a middle game principle, and while you might argue with me and say that this is a middle game, it can be very, very useful in the end game as well, as we'll see. For one, of course, this spatial advantage in the center keeps d7 as a weakness, but the spatial advantage on the king side as well is going to be quite relevant, as we'll see. So in the game, queen d3 was played by Ulf, which is very natural to just immediately attack this guy. Rook f7 by Dimitrij to keep the pawn. And then we see Ulf do a little bit of shuffling. He goes queen e3, talking to this rook on a7. So rook a8 is chosen. And now rook d3 is very, very natural, right? He's just doubling his rooks against the pawn on d7. Rook f5 is Dimitrij's choice. We see now knight c5 applies more pressure to this guy. Rook d8 to defend. Rook f to d1. And then the saddest move of all time is knight b8. And I feel like this is a problem that everybody runs into at some point during their chess career, where you should be better, right? Like, white has to be better here. You feel like white should just be winning, right? This d7 pawn is so horribly weak that there's just absolutely no way black can be doing okay here, right? Your opponent just played the move knight b8. How on God's green earth is this going to be surviving for black? But then you realize that if you play a move like queen d2, black plays rook f7, and you have to ask yourself, well, now what? Okay, well, sorry, queen d2 is pretty bad. Queen d2 is pretty bad, right? I guess now is the time to ask yourself, now what, right? You can't really play queen d2 and hang a knight, and you can't really increase the pressure on d7. Even if you could, rook f7 would defend this guy again. And so it's like, well, now what, Black has this weakness. I attacked it as many times as I possibly could. You know, what's next for white here? And that is where Ulf starts to shine in this game. That's where his technique is sort of unbeatable. By the way, even though this position looks so horribly awful, I will just straight up tell you that Black is doing much, much better than he was after the move G4 in the first game we looked at. Remember when White played G4 in the first game and like Black looked uncomfortable but not losing? Here, Black is doing much, much better in this position than he was after G4 in the previous game. Right, so even though D7 looks so optically ugly, it's not that bad. Not that bad. Not just straight up lost, at least. So yeah, Ulf's first step is to make sure that his opponent doesn't have any type of activity. This rook on B5, and he goes G4, rook F7, right? Which is fine. It's great. Knight B7 fork. Okay, so yeah, what happens on Knight B7? This is a important question. One which definitely deserves an answer, which I am thinking of currently. Yeah, what's wrong with Knight B7? You guys make a good point here. What the heck? I didn't even see this move when I was analyzing. Knight B7, huh? Something must be wrong. Yeah, I don't know. I guess rook F8, if we take this guy, then this guy hangs. Yeah, this makes sense. Okay, so G4, rook F7, I guess, should always be included to start with. And now if you play Knight B7, obviously this is here. So yeah, the point is Knight B7 wasn't working because of tactics. So King G3 was played in the game, and now rook DF8 is played immediately anyways. So Knight B7 looked tempting, but there was always going to be a pawn hanging in the previous positions. Which is why now, after Knight B7, of course, there is no threat, and rook takes F4 would be good. So now rook F1. And you might be thinking, well, hang on a second. Let's rewind a second. Let's rewind. Okay, you can argue that H5 is a little bit weak here, but it seems like, you know, everything was under control for white in this position. And now all of a sudden, after G4, we have a weakness on F4, a weakness which our opponent is doubling up on. So what the heck? Why did Ulf give himself this weakness on F4? What do you think, guys? Why give himself a weakness like this? You know, it was such a one-sided game. And now all of a sudden Black is seemingly getting some counterplay on our F-pawn. So what's the big idea here? Chess King says he blundered. Fair enough. Fair enough. Did he have a choice? So, yeah, you could argue that because H5 was already weak, he sort of had to go for this, but not necessarily. Like, a move like Knight E4 would be playable here, right? If rook takes H5, then, you know, this rook sort of gets stuck on this side of the board, right? Tactically, I'm not so sure that this is what Black wants out of life. Knight F6 check is coming. This rook is dying. But G4 was played. And you could argue maybe he just missed this. But I would argue that he played the G4 with a very specific reason, right? D7 wasn't weak. I mean, it's weak, but one weakness is not enough to win a chess game. So what Ulf does with G4 is he introduces new ideas into the position on the king's side. He's using this spatial advantage to give himself some ideas of either pushing for F5 or pushing for G5 at a later date in the game. And now Black, in addition to having to worry about D7, is going to have to worry about these ideas on the king's side as well. Black chose the move Queen E8 here. Which, I mean, it's as good of a move as any for Black. It allows this knight some freedom to move by introducing this rook's defense to D7. Rook F2 is sort of passing for a second for white. Queen E7 is played. Rook D to D2 is played. And we see Queen E2. Yet this, I'm going to level with you, isn't much more than shuffling for the moment. Rook D1, Queen E8, Rook D2, Queen E7, Rook D1, Queen E8, and finally Knight D3. So knight d3, of course, relieves some of the pressure on this d7 pawn. Black chooses knight c6 now to bring this knight back into play. And now queen e4 by Ulf centralizes the queen and puts it on a better square. Queen b8 now by Dimitrij is an attempt, believe it or not, to find some activity. This knight comes back to c5 now with a threat to the d7 pawn. And rather than just defend this guy, Dimitrij actually plays an interesting move, queen b6. So now, what happens if knight takes d7? Everybody wants to know. Well, turns out rook takes d7, rook takes d7, queen g1 is just going to be a simple perpetual. No way out of this one for white. In fact, no other legal moves. Or, of course, you can go to h3 first, and it's a perpetual. So this pawn, not capturable. Not capturable. So instead, we see the move queen e3 back by Ulf. Now the knight comes back to b8 to deal with the threat to d7. We see the knight come back to d3, offering a trade of queens. Black is fine with this queen on b6, so we see more shuffling. And eventually, we do see Ulf kind of crack and trade queens on b6 to keep the game going. Lost tempo. Well, it's one of those positions where black wasn't really going to be doing anything with the extra time, so we saw both players shuffling for a bit until Ulf decided on the best way forward. So we see c takes b6. Right, okay. We got the rooks off the board. Now, how do we continue in this position? Well, of course, we should reroute this knight to a better square, and Ulf does just that with the move knight to f2. Rook e to f8 is natural now to keep the pressure up on f4. Ulf brings this rook to d3, seemingly for not too much of a good reason. It does sort of solidify this rook on f3, so no, it is for a good reason. This was a threat, okay? There you go, that's the reason. Had to defend the rook. Rook a8 now is passing for black. Knight e4 finally comes on the board, and all of a sudden the knight lands on d6. Rook f to f8 is played, and now knight b5 is another good square for this white knight. Rook f to d8 now to defend against d7, but now after rook d6, the pressure is sort of mounting again. King f8 is played for black. He needs a second defender of the d7 pawn after rook d3, so now king e7. And finally, white plays this move, knight d4, trading off even more pieces, okay? So a takes b3, a takes b3, and black sort of jumps at this opportunity to get the knights off the board, right? His knight wasn't doing too much more than shuffling between these two squares. Rook a to b8 comes on the board, and now finally it is white to move and get a winning advantage here. White to move and get a winning advantage. So there's actually only one move, I would argue, that that is winning here for whites. Only one move. So yeah, it's actually not so much going to be g5 here. Why isn't it going to be g5? Well, white certainly isn't worse after g5, but black can actually find some activity here. How can black find some activity? Well, with this move, rook to a8. Now, if we take, black can take. If we go something like king g4, pretty natural. Rook a1 is going to give us some activity. And if we go rook takes b6, by the way, still rook a1. And the two rooks for black are going to sort of come careening into the game. All right. And it's true that white might be winning in this position as well. I think this rook's a bit better. For some checks, obviously this is not the ideal situation for white. Now, is g5 a bad move? I'm going to say that probably white is still winning, but I think f5 is by far the clearest way to win this game for white. The reason being, you get to keep this g file closed, and if black tries the same with something like rook a8, first of all, this stuff is still going to be very, very good, And secondly, now if something like rook a3 or rook a1, we have this extra idea of f takes e6 and trading these guys off and taking whichever pawn we want and winning with 2 extra pawns very clearly. Now I think g5 wins the games as well. I was sort of exaggerating when I said only one move wins, but f5 is sort of the clearest. In the game, black tried b5 to keep this b pawn on the board, and now after c5, Ulf is still just dominating. Rook b to c8, but now c6 is the killer idea. And this is going to be an idea in many, many games where you see one player sort of have a crushing space advantage. Because white's pawns are so far advanced up the board, black is unable to take this pawn because the king and pawn endgame is sort of hopeless. There's this tactic of f6 check, and this will get the job done, right? Because white's pawns were so far advanced, these tactics just do not work out for black. So c6 is a winner. Rook c7 was played in the game, and now the king and pawn endgame once again is going to be hopeless for black, with black essentially being down a pawn. Of course, technically these are 2 pawns, but in a sense they really are just 1. King f4 was played in the game, and black went ahead and resigned this position. If you go something like king e7, I think pretty much everything wins here. King e4, for example. And if you start going this way, keep a lookout for f takes e6 or even f6 here. Tough. Tough, 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 right? Tough, tough, tough. Same ending with g5 wouldn't have worked. You might have a point there. That might be why f5 is just so much better. If b5, c5, here c6. Yeah, and this stuff wouldn't work anymore. There's no f6 check. So that's why f5 is better. It all makes sense. Okay. So, questions on this endgame. I feel like I was a little bit less clear with my points on this game. The points I was trying to get across to review really quickly were, yes, black has this weakness on d7, but that is not enough to win a chess endgame. One weakness is not enough to end a chess and to win a chess endgame. So Ulf instead pushes this move g4 and keeps this idea of f5 sort of in his back pocket until the moment is right for him to play f5 and get this sort of winning advantage, right? He uses this space on the king side to introduce more threats into the game, and eventually his opponent cracked under the pressure. And that is why Ulf wins this game. We saw, of course, a lot of shuffling in this game, and Lichess is killing me here. A lot of shuffling in this game, back and forth, and eventually we see black trying to activate this queen, but this queen trade for white ends up allowing him to improve this knight out to b6 and over to d6 and over to b5. And with this trade of knights, rook b8, f5, and the game is over. Yeah, the queen trade did not really give black relief. It only allowed white to activate this knight even further and eventually trade off the important defensive knight for black. All right. Let us do one more game before we call it a day here. I do have one more for you guys. This one is going to be Ulf against Michael Francis Stean. And in this game, we have yet again another English opening. So let's see how this one went. Just kidding, nobody cares. Go fast, find the endgame. Go fast. Queen takes d1. Critical mistake. Critical mistake for black. It's the best move in the position. It's the only move in the position, but never trade queens against Ulf Andersson. Okay, it's just a mistake. And we do see Ulf take on c6 as well to slightly fracture the opponent's pawn structure. We see knight c3, e5, bishop e3 now for Ulf, trying to control the square in front of the pawn. h5, h4, bishop b4, king d2, king e7, rook h to c1. And I'm sort of just playing through the moves here. I want one more trade of the pieces. We see bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, and bishop d5. So, what's going on in this endgame? Obviously, We know who won. It was Ulf. And we know that white should be better because this pawn on c6 is a bit backwards. But how good is it really? How good is it really? How good is it really? Do we think white should be able to win this game? And if so, how? Should white be able to win this game, and how? So Mark and or Tracy says opposite color bishops, so it should be holdable. Okay, bishop g5, by the way, doesn't win the game. There's just f6, and it's okay. Paul says it seems drawing. A few other people say white is better, but they don't know if it's winning. So yeah, here's the problem for white, right? It's sort of similar to what we saw in the last game, where black has a weakness, but it's well defended, right? It's well defended, even more easily defended than in the previous position. So what's the issue for white? Well, the issue for white is, yeah, you have this, pleasant looking position, but I don't know what white's plan is, right? That's the issue. Most of the endgames I look at in this endgame class are endgames where either there's a clear defensive plan for one side or a clear attacking plan for the other side. And the problem is, finding that plan and making sure you're playing that plan. And the thing that's incredible about a lot of these Ulf endgames, these Ulf Andersson endgames, is that there's no plan, right? It seems like white doesn't have a plan. It seems like black is just gonna, defensively sit there forever and ever and ever, and then Ulf Andersson ends up winning anyways. And I would be willing to call it, a special type of plan, where Ulf is able to just sort of sit on these positions forever and ever and ever and introduce these like minuscule looking threats until, the moment when the opponent just can't take it anymore and starts to crumble. So the way to start in this case is not with any, funny checks. Moving this pawn to f6 is only an improvement for black's position, I think. But the way to start is to more firmly lock down on all of these dark squares. So we see white play this move b4, and now black plays sort of any move. Rook d to b8 was his choice. Really doesn't matter for black. Bishop d2 by white is Ulf's choice. We see king e6, and then just to make sure that nothing really happens, we see rook c5 by white, firmly locking down this a5 break, making sure that black doesn't get any activity. By the way, if black tried this move a5 here, he would in fact be losing a pawn, thanks to this tactic that Ulf had set up with this bishop on d2. So if it was playable, then black would have loved to play a5, but I don't think it was ever going to be very good. For example, here, it still tactically loses. After rook b8, we saw this tactic with bishop d2, and so after king e6 defending this pawn, it's now important for Ulf to make sure that a5 can't be played. And that's actually pretty relevant. Black would very, very much love to open the a file and have some activity for his rooks, but he was unable to thanks to these tactics that Ulf Andersson found. Rook b5 was played now by black, trying to, again, get these ideas of a5 to sort of go through, alleviating some of this pressure. And Ulf just plays this move, rook c to c1, keeping pieces on the board. Of course, now with this bishop here no longer being interfered with the rook on c3, white is very comfortably able to stop a5. Rook a to c1. Well, rook a to c1 would potentially allow the opponent to trade rooks. I'm not saying black should trade rooks, but if you want to sit on a position forever, you want to keep as many pieces on as you can in most cases. So rook c to c1 is Ulf's choice. f6 is a good improving move now for black. And how should we continue here with white? I'm curious to see what you guys think the good continuation is here for white once again. There are a couple ideas to consider. So yeah, white isn't really interested in doing things, too crazy here with stuff like g4. But yeah, the two main ideas in the position are in the chat now. So a4 is a great move for white. You are just claiming this one light square as your own, but what effect this has is it sort of makes the 5th rank entirely uncontested for white. White is going to be very happy to plant a rook on the 5th rank and always be pressuring e5 and indirectly h5 sort of forever from the 5th rank. In addition, stopping a5 also very, very relevant. So playing a4 is a good start to take over this 5th rank with rook c5 to come. And then after rook g8, we see the other idea being mentioned in the chat, f3. f3 is a great move here for white. Is white trying to play the move e4 right away? Well, yes, because it tactically wins. But deeper than that, of course, black doesn't have to allow the move e4, but it is provoking weaknesses along this newly taken over 5th rank. Black has this option. He can play e4, but this has the effect of weakening h5 and in fact losing a pawn immediately. Or black can play this move f5, which does of course weaken all of these pawns along the 5th rank now. And just like that, a position where there was only one weakness for black on c6 has turned into a position where black has, sort of 4 different pawns to keep track of, right? White took over the 5th rank, is now pressuring all of these guys as well as the c6 pawn. And it's these sneaky little ideas that Ulf sort of uses that win him all of these endgames that are seemingly impossible to actually win. He finds these ways to create more weaknesses for the opponent, and then things just start to crumble. So what should have been done instead of this? Well, perhaps e4 would have been a prudent idea here for black, stopping f3 before it ever gets played. Instead, though, of course, we retreated to this idea of f5, and now Ulf stays really, really solid, plays king f2 before anything else, making sure these pawns are all well defended. Rook over d8 is Michael's idea. And now, Ulf plays this move bishop c3, and this move actually comes with a threat. So who sees the threats? I'm not going to pause for too long here. Of course, the threat is to play, if black does nothing, the threat is to play e4, and after takes and takes, this would be a mistake due to rook takes e5 with check. So bishop c3, and this is what I mean by Ulf just sort of poking and prodding, creating these tiny, tiny little threats against black's weaknesses, and just waiting for black to sort of fall apart. So after bishop c3, really the best way for black to respond to this is with the move e4, which is played in the game, trying to get rid of this weak e-pawn and get all of the weaknesses at least onto dark square or light squares where they can be defended by the bishop. Ulf continues now with rook d1, activating his final piece into the game, taking advantage of this pin. Rook d to d7 is Michael's choice to break the pin on the bishop, allow this bishop to capture back on e4 if necessary. And now king e3, activating the true final piece for white, which is of course the king. g6 now by black to try and shore up these weaknesses. And now a rather counterintuitive move by Ulf appears on the board, and it's a move which I think is just wrong. I don't think f4 really was the best way to play for a win here. I very much would have preferred to see Ulf keep the option of king f4 and king g5 alive and just continue playing the position, right? You can also try something like f takes e4, trade one set of rooks, and then still have these ideas of invading with the king. But f4, I think, does lock down the position in a way that favors black. So f4 played in the game, but I don't think this is one of those ideas that you should sort of take to heart. I think this one was a mistake, in my opinion. But okay, it's in the game. Let us continue. Rook d6 played now, and now we do start a little bit of a shuffle fest. Rook b1, rook d7, bishop d4, king f7, b2, king e6, king d2, king f7, king c3, king e6, rook a5, king f7, rook a6, rook e7, and shuffle, shuffle, shuffle. White invades now with this bishop, rook e to d7, rook d2, rook b to c7, and basically what black is saying is, okay, you have two things to attack. I fixed my weaknesses on the king side, and yeah, go ahead, attack them. I'm never moving any of my pieces again. Bishop e3, pass, 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 shuffle, 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 shuffle. And finally, Ulf plays this move e3. Doesn't change the position too much. Shuffle, 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 shuffle. Shuffle, 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 shuffle. And then, finally now, what is the idea if black shuffles again? Ulf has orchestrated his pieces perfectly now for the knockout blow. And yeah, rook c to a5, and all of a sudden there is a third attacker on the a5 pawn, and the game is over, right? 3 attackers is enough. So what could black have done about this? Really not a whole lot, right? It was just basically very good play by Ulf. And honestly, he might have seen this coming from here, which is sort of obscene, right? That's just sort of ridiculous. I think black might have been able to draw the game if he tried this idea of a6, and the point now is after rook a5. It's true, you're attacking my guy, but bishop c4 is going to be a sort of important defensive idea, and rook d5 to follow is going to be forcing some simplifications, right? If you don't play rook a5, if you go something like rook b1, rook c1, for example, king f7, for example, and retreat this along this file, all of a sudden, rook b6 is going to be the defensive idea. And basically, no matter what you do, there's always going to be a way for black to defend this a-pawn, right? Rook a8, for example. And with the pawn on a6, it's very difficult to add a second attacker. Basically, this is the issue for white, rather. But in the game, we see this pawn stay on a6, or stay on a7, and then Ulf just brings around this third rook over 30 different moves. Not quite that many, and the game is over. So rook b6 was chosen instead by Michael, but now the rook comes over, and this pawn, well, this pawn on a7 was going to fall. And after bishop a2, the pawn on c6 falls, and the game is won by white. Okay, so questions on this endgame, which once again, Ulf Andersson just absolutely crushes his opponent with his unbeatable technique. So questions on this one. And then questions in general about this type of endgame play. Let me switch back now. I think we are about to wrap it up for the day then. Why did he play bishop a2? Well, the position was just lost for black. Bishop a2 was... I honestly don't know why it was played, but black was sort of helpless there. Rook takes a7 was coming, or bishop takes a7 rather. White should take with the bishop rather than the rook. Keeping rooks on the board is, in general, important in opposite color bishop positions. Will I be on Twitch? So yes, directly after this class, I will be going live on Twitch with Analyze Your Games. So if you are watching live and want me to analyze some of your games rather than some of top-level grandmasters games, then go ahead and go on and head over to Twitch. James says, can someone really see 30 moves in advance? Well, it's less about seeing that many moves in advance and more about realizing there's nothing active that black can do, so black is essentially going to be shuffling back and forth and then trying to come up with the perfect construction of pieces for white. And that's what Ulf was able to do. Link, please. I can type it. Why not? Why not type it here? Twitch.tv/STL Chess Club. Did that work? Maybe that didn't work. That did work. All right. So yeah, that is going to do it for us here today. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you guys next time as I click over here. Goodbye.